This is Brother Peter Diamond, vaticancatholic.com. I wanted to talk about Catholicism and America. I recently read a book called The Faithful, A History of Catholics in America by James M. O'Toole, published by Harvard University Press. I wanted to quickly discuss some of the interesting quotes in the book and talk about the topic a little bit. One of the interesting facts is that at the beginning of America, prior to the signing of the Constitution, there were very few Catholic priests in America. Some colonies actually had laws against Catholic priests and the spread of Catholicism. For example, in Massachusetts in 1647 there was an anti-priest law. It stated that any Jesuit or ecclesiastical person ordained by the authority of the Pope is not allowed within their jurisdiction, and that if anyone was suspected of being such a person, he was to be banished, and if he came back, he was to be put to death. The first Catholic Mass was not said in Boston until the 1770s. Hence, there was a lot of anti-Catholic discrimination in the American colonies. But Maryland was the American colony founded under Catholic auspices. That's why it's called Maryland. But even in Maryland, there were few Catholics, and the freedom for the spread of Catholicism depended upon who was the governor. When there was a Catholic governor, there was more freedom, but if there was an anti-Catholic governor, the freedom of the Catholic Church was limited. But once the Constitution was signed and really put in place in the decades following it, the freedom to practice the Catholic religion spread, and Catholicism was able to grow and eventually to flourish. And it should probably be noted that there were different states that were connected to different churches. There were state churches. But by 1830, all of those state churches had been abolished. So there are 2 points that I wanted to make about this. The first is that it's interesting that at the beginning of the United States, there were few Catholic priests. And O'Toole has some very interesting quotes about the ratio of Catholics to priests. For example, on page 13, he says, in Maryland, according to a report to Rome in 1780, there were almost 16,000 Catholics, but only 19 priests. In Pennsylvania, there were 7,000 Catholics and 5 priests. In New York City, 1,500 Catholics and not a single priest, end quote. For that reason, Catholics rarely got to Mass. Some went months, some went over a year without hearing Mass. Therefore, the obligation that normally binds one to attend Mass on Sunday did not apply. The same is true in our day of the Great Apostasy, when there are very few options for traditional sacraments and basically no authentic Catholic priests. So I personally find it interesting that at the beginning of this country there were few Catholic priests, few options for a traditional authentic Mass, and now in our day in the Great Apostasy, in a time that looks to be possibly like the end of this country, or at least the end of what this country has been, there are few Catholic priests, few options for sacraments. It's a spiritual desert in many ways, just like it was at the beginning. In line with this, O'Toole points out how priests would travel far and wide, and they would have to go long ways to reach the faithful scattered all over the place. With this context, we can also understand why Pope Leo XIII in his 1895 encyclical Longinqua had some positive things to say about the United States Constitution. In number 6 of that encyclical, he says, quote, "For the Church amongst you, unopposed by the Constitution and government of your nation, fettered by no hostile legislation, protected against violence by the common laws and the impartiality of the tribunals, is free to live and act without hindrance." End quote. So he's pointing out that the Constitution at least allows Catholics to operate on a level playing field, theoretically, and does not suppress the preaching of the faith, the establishment of churches, and the public proclamation of the necessity to embrace the faith, etc. But he goes on to say that, yet, although this is true, it would be very erroneous to draw the conclusion that in America is to be sought the type of the most desirable status of the Church, or that it would be universally lawful or expedient for state and church to be, as in America, dissevered and divorced, end quote. So he's still condemning separation of church and state, and he's making it clear that it's not ideal. It's actually opposed to the laws of God and what the church teaches. But compared with the alternative, a situation in which Catholicism is suppressed and limited, this is a much better situation. That's his point, and he is correct. I emphasize that because you have liberals who will focus on how Leo XIII had some positive things to say about the Constitution and ignore the fact that he actually condemned, still within that context, the separation of church and state. And then you have some other radical schismatics who condemn him for saying anything positive about the Constitution when they totally miss the point, which is that he's praising it in the context of what it allowed as opposed to the alternative, and the previous situation the church found herself in when it was suppressed in the colonial atmosphere. And so you had very few priests at first, but once there was more freedom and more immigration from Europe and Catholic countries in Europe, Catholicism really started to gain momentum and gain converts and establish churches, and it was very interesting to see some of the stats about the number of masses that were said, the number of priests who were in residence at certain churches in the 1800s and the 1900s. It's just amazing when we consider the spiritual desert in which we live today. And I wanted to give a few quotes on this. And then I want to talk about what happened after Vatican II. For example, on page 101, O'Toole points out that in 1830, Catholics were only 3% of the population, but by 1850 it was up to 8%, and by 1900 it was 18%. Detroit, for instance, had 15 parishes in 1880, 29 by 1900, and 89 when the floodgates of immigration closed in 1925, end quote. And so as people had access to a real mass, and at that time priests who were more Catholic, and at that time most of the priests still believed in the necessity of the church, and so people were attracted to the church, and it gained a lot of converts, and the number of masses that were available to people is staggering. For example, on pages 115 and 116, O'Toole points out that, quote, Catholics in Milwaukee in 1920 were faced with an embarrassment of riches. St. Aldebert's, a Polish parish on the city's near south side, had 8 masses each Sunday, every hour on the hour from 5 a.m. until noon. Every weekday it had 4 masses at half-hour intervals between 7 and 8:30. Across town, the Jesuit church had 4 Sunday masses upstairs and 3 downstairs, end quote. So this one parish, and there were parishes all over the place, had 8 masses on Sunday and 4 every day. That's how many people were coming to church and mass, daily even. That might be the amount of masses that you would have at some of the largest churches in the country today, when the population is much greater, and that was just one parish. Not only the number of masses and the number of people attending mass grew to huge numbers, but the number of priests and vocations and religious. There's a quote on page 116 in which he points out that, quote, by 1925, the number of parishes in Cleveland had grown to 89, and 53 of those, 60%, were staffed by a pastor who had at least one assistant priest living and working with him. Now the parish might offer 4, 6, or even more masses every Sunday. Brooklyn in 1925 had an even greater concentration of clergy. The borough was home to 127 parish churches, 83 of them, 65%, with 2 or more curates in addition to the pastor, end quote. Now, it's very interesting to consider the large numbers of people attending Mass, the large numbers of people entering the priesthood, etc., but that doesn't necessarily equate to holiness or to people being saved. It's interesting that even during this period when Catholicism was flourishing, few people were going to communion. On page 121, O'Toole says that, quote, in Boston in May 1899, a priest in a large parish of Irish and German immigrants reported that about 700 people were at his 7:45 Mass one Sunday morning, and that exactly 40 of them came to communion, end quote. That seems to fit with what the saints and Catholic writers have held throughout history, that even few Catholics are saved. And so during this period, while we saw more people nominally embracing the faith, going to church, there still is evidence that a much smaller number were actually taking advantage of all of these Catholic opportunities to receive sacraments, hear masses, etc., and getting into the state of grace as a result. Something else that's somewhat interesting is that he points out on page 77 that distinctive clothing for the Catholic clergy, including the so-called Roman collar, would not become common in the United States until the end of the 19th century. End quote. I find that somewhat interesting because, especially in the traditional movement, we have people who are consumed with externals. They are often more persuaded by seeing pictures of people in cassocks or priestly garb or habits than they are about the substance of what people believe and promote, and many are deceived in that way. Something else that's very interesting is that as all these churches were being built in the 1800s, they were really going up quickly. There were these trustee disputes between lay people and the clergy concerning the ownership of parishes, expenses, and related matters. O'Toole gives some interesting examples of battles that occurred, and it became a somewhat widespread problem. The lay people would position themselves as part of a corporation that owned the church, and sometimes do battle with the priest or a priest they did not like. This is extremely interesting because we see the same thing today, especially, or rather primarily, in the traditionalist movement. There are in fact numerous false traditionalists who specialize in taking over various churches by dishonest and underhanded means. Some of them are prominent and even lawyers. They will file for a new corporation or try to assume control of the existing corporation, and they will try to do it in a fashion that is arguably legal, but in reality dishonest. In that way, they will attempt to assume control of the church's corporation, remove it from the people who were actually operating the corporation or in possession of the church, and then take it over in that way. And so it's interesting to see that these battles over churches occurred back then, until in 1829 when the Council of Baltimore met and put a stop to this. After the Council of Baltimore met, a lone person corporation with the bishop in control of the church became the norm. That's just an aside. It's also interesting that before the collection plate was distributed in churches, both in Catholic and Protestant churches in America, pews were sold or rented. People were actually given a deed which proved their right to sit in a particular pew, and that was how it worked until that situation was replaced by the passing of the collection plate. And so Catholicism continued to grow and actually flourish in terms of numbers of vocations, people coming to church, number of priests, the number of masses available. And in the 1940s, there was a Catholic priest who had a radio program named Father Coughlin. There's some interesting facts about Coughlin. He was extremely popular at the time, and he also talked about the existence of various conspiracies. O'Toole says on pages 168 and 169, quote, "It was said that with every radio tuned into his program at the same time, one could hear Coughlin's voice in the very air, simply by walking down the street of any Catholic neighborhood. He cited church teachings as the solution to the nation's economic woes. He saw the slowness of the recovery from the New Deal in increasingly conspiratorial terms." And this is O'Toole saying, "This led him into virulent anti-Semitism. International Jewish bankers were the real culprits," he concluded. He was finally forced off the air in 1942. End quote. So I find it interesting that Coughlin was talking about the international banking conspiracy and how Jews play a prominent role in that, and he was forced off the air. This author, O'Toole, while his book is extremely detailed and very interesting, he is an utter liberal. He even favors women priests and the Vatican II, apostasy. It's also interesting that during this period in the 1950s, when there was a real doctrinal breakdown occurring, in fact, at this time, most people who claimed to be Catholic were unfortunately denying the necessity of the Church for salvation. In the 1950s, this Bishop Fulton Sheen, with whom many people are familiar, he had a television show on ABC, and at one point, Sheen actually had 30 million listeners. He had a prime-time show on ABC. The problem, however, was that Sheen reflected a watered-down, gutted false Catholicism, which most people had adopted by that time, according to which people can be saved outside the church. According to O'Toole, the author of The Faithful, Sheen, on his television show, quote, never prayed or discussed specific Catholic doctrines. Instead, he echoed the non-denominational messages of such Protestant and Jewish preachers as Norman Vincent Peale and Joshua Loth Liebman. Sheen's point was simple. Life was indeed worth living if one turned attention periodically to higher things. For Americans who had put their, quote, faith in faith, Sheen's message did not require adherence to Catholicism, end quote. And so his message was essentially, quote, inspirational, conservative in terms of non-denominationally conservative. And he would speak against communism, and therefore in the process he would compromise. This is an example of how large numbers do not necessarily equate to success. He was reaching 30 million people, but was he reaching them with the truth? No, he wasn't. Sheen was in fact an outrageous apostate. His television program was so acceptable and palatable to non-Catholic audiences that it's still rerun on the Protestant Trinity Broadcasting Network. And Sheen was an example of the heretical bishop and priest that set the stage for the Vatican II Great Apostasy. By the way, there's an extremely heretical statement from Sheen on the dogma, outside the church there is no salvation. It's so bad that even one of the priests of the Society of St. Pius X, who himself denies the salvation dogma and authored an outrageously dishonest book on the topic, he actually criticized Sheen on the topic, and he quotes Sheen. Sheen says, quote, I studied and read so many things about what we used to call the salvation of pagans. How were these unbelievers saved? In the 11th century, we were given the theology of baptism of desire. But when you travel the world, visit leper colonies, see human beings fighting with vultures in the garbage heaps of Latin America, when you see the poverty of the great cities of the world, when you see 250,000 sleeping in the streets of Calcutta, when you see starving women with starving children strapped on their backs, when I saw all these things, I never saw so many Christs in my life. I saw them everywhere. Maybe I saw more there than here, but in a different way. When you say that they do not know Christ, they do not need to know. End quote. So Sheen's saying that these pagans don't need to know Christ. As long as they endure hardships in their lives, that's their salvation, and they are in fact other Christs. And it's so heretical that even this SSPX priest who denies the dogma basically condemned his statement. And Sheen went on to embrace the Vatican II apostasy, false ecumenism, so he was really a false teacher and a false prophet who led people into this watered-down, non-denominational, conservative type of religion. And around this same time, of course, there was the Father Feeney affair. Father Feeney, a Jesuit priest living in the Boston area. O'Toole mentions this on page 254. He says, by 1949, Feeney was giving a rigorous reading to an ancient church maxim, first articulated in the contest with paganism in the 3rd century. Outside the church, there is no salvation. Feeney interpreted this literally to mean that all non-Catholics, Protestants, Jews, Muslims, and everybody else is simply going to hell. Serious theologians had moved away from this absolutist view, but the Feeney group insisted on it. End quote. Well, of course, what Feeney was saying about that was the dogmatic teaching of the Church, the teaching of the popes, the specific teaching of the Council of Florence, but that was being rejected. And in its place, outside the Church there is no salvation meant there is salvation outside the Church. And since he was one of the only priests, basically the only priest at that time, who still believed in the dogma, he was being opposed. And it wasn't about the issue of whether unbaptized catechumens can be saved, as a lot of the modern-day heretics would like to portray it. It was about whether you have to be Catholic, period. Feeney was saying yes, the people who opposed him, no. It just shows you how heretical the clergy were in the 50s and in the 40s. This was the heretical climate that gave way and set the stage for this post-Vatican II apostasy. And people say that Father Feeney was condemned by the Church. Not true. We have a whole section on that in our book, Outside the Catholic Church. There is absolutely no salvation. The so-called Holy Office letter that denounced him was not only heretical, it not only directly contradicted Catholic teaching on the body of the Church, but it's not infallible for many reasons. It was not promulgated in specific form by Pius XII, And that's discussed in our book, and there's much more to say about that, but I don't want to spend too much time on it here. And then the Vatican II apostasy occurred, and there are some very interesting quotes in O'Toole's book concerning the desolation that ensued after Vatican II. I'm not going to talk about the heresies in Vatican II. You can see our website and material for all of those. But he admits on page 255 that Vatican II changed Catholic teaching on religious liberty. He says, quote, "Moreover, largely at the prompting of John Courtney Murray, another American Jesuit, the Council, meaning Vatican II, endorsed the principle of religious freedom. Earlier popes and councils had rejected any such idea. Error had no rights, the saying went." End quote. O'Toole is a liberal, apparently professing to be Catholic. He seems to profess to be Catholic. And he seems to support all of Vatican II's changes. And he's admitting that Vatican II denied previous teaching on religious liberty. He also acknowledges the disappearance of traditional devotions, the disastrous effects of the liturgical reform. He provides a very interesting summation of the devastation on page 223. He says, quote, "At the same time, a number of traditional devotions disappeared from American Catholic practice. Vespers and benediction, for example, staples in churches on Sunday afternoons since the early 19th century, were abandoned nearly everywhere." End quote. And that's another thing I didn't cover, but he has numerous quotes about how many people not only would show up at Mass, but would also show up for benediction and Vespers, and that these practices disappeared after Vatican II. In the same way, it's fascinating to consider some of the quotes concerning the changes in confession practice. Prior to Vatican II, and when the Church was flourishing in terms of numbers, many people were approaching confession. On pages 182 to 183, he says, quote, "At St. Benedict's, a church in Highland Park, Michigan, in 1949, for example, priests heard confessions every Saturday from 3 to 6 in the afternoon, and again from 7:30 to 9:30. So that's 5 hours of confessions just on Saturday. The parish even specified an hour, 11 until noon, on Saturday morning when children could confess. Additional hours were also provided before certain feasts like Christmas or Easter. During Lent, at least one priest was also available every weekday morning between 8:30 and 9. End quote. But after Vatican II, confession vanished. He points out on pages 217 to 219, quote, "The decline was evident in local churches everywhere. In 1962, St. Thomas Aquinas Parish in the Jamaica Plain section of Boston made priests available for confession for 3.5 hours every Saturday afternoon and evenings. In 1969, this was cut back to an hour and a half, and by 1990 it had been reduced again to just half an hour. Parishioners were simply not coming. For all practical purposes, the regular confession of sins had ceased to be a part of American Catholic life." End quote. So in 1962, they were available for 3.5 hours every Saturday, simply because Vatican II really hadn't been implemented yet, and the practice of making themselves available for so many hours for confession was retained from before Vatican II. However, by 1969, they cut it back to an hour and a half because people weren't coming, and then by 1990 it was reduced to a half an hour. And at most churches today, no confessions are heard at all, and if any are heard, it's by appointment. One of the most striking quotes I found in the book concerned Saturday Mass, this practice in the Novus Ordo Church of allowing people to fulfill their Sunday obligation on Saturday instead of on Sunday. And of course, when that was implemented by the Vatican II Church, it was a complete novelty. It was something that had never been seen before in the tradition of the Church. He points out on page 206, quote, "Few lay people ever heard of the notion of a liturgical day, but they got used to the new schedule. In Pittsburgh by 1990, fully 1/4 of all Sunday Masses were offered on Saturday." End quote. So, in Pittsburgh, 1/4 of all the Masses were given on Saturday, not Sunday. It's a total replacement of the Holy Day. This was the devil's way of eradicating the Sunday obligation. And even some Novus Ordo priests wondered about this, as heretical as they were. He quotes one who said, "I have some doubts about Saturday Mass," one bishop said in March 1969, "since it means a real change in the practice of worship among our people." End quote. That's correct. It's the eradication of Sunday worship. Something else that's interesting is that on page 183, he acknowledges the traditional prohibition against attending and participating in non-Catholic services. He says, quote, "In 1942, for example, at a time when Catholics were warned never to attend Protestant religious services, a man who had tuned in to a non-Catholic program on the radio was told that if he had listened only out of curiosity, his sin was venial. If he had intended to take part in some way in the service, he had committed a mortal sin." End quote. It's simply a fact that the Church condemned under pain of mortal sin participation in non-Catholic worship, but the Vatican II Church officially teaches that it's good and acceptable to participate in non-Catholic worship. It's taught in Vatican II, it's taught in their official directory, it's taught in John Paul II's encyclicals, and it's exhibited by all of the anti-popes. It's also interesting that he has this quote concerning a heretical confession guide that popped up after Vatican II. On page 218 he says, "After Vatican II, a mother in New Hampshire was amazed to hear her pastor tell the children of his first communion class that they should stay away from confession unless they had committed a mortal sin, of which few of them were capable. That kind of talk was all the added encouragement many lay people needed to abandon their earlier confession habits." End quote. He also points out that lay ministers started to be approved, and we posted this on our website about how a laicized and Protestant-style church was being formed after Vatican II. He says on page 269, quote, "Encouraged in part by the example of the growing ranks of lay people with official roles in parish churches, the number of lay ministers had surpassed the number of priests in the country by the mid-1990s. The laity seemed determined to make the real assertion that they were the church." End quote. And just a few other points I wanted to cover. As the desolation was being seen and felt everywhere in the Vatican II Church, and churches were closing due to the sex scandal and the lack of vocations and the lack of interest, people were protesting when their local parishes would be closed. And this is really interesting because it shows that while these people don't care at all about the substance of the Catholic faith, about the real teaching of Jesus Christ, about the gospel, about the necessity of the church, they do care about their building. It's all about community. It's all about showing up at a church. It's about being around others. Even with most traditionalists, this is the case. That's why they latch on to these heretical priestly groups, and they don't care about the substance of the faith, because their faith is defined by other people. It's defined by fellowship. It's defined by communal activity. They don't have a real supernatural relationship with God, which would go with them wherever they were. And they don't live the faith each day. It's defined by others. It's really a club. It's about heritage, nostalgia, where they were married, and it's really impure and in fact disgusting. And so it's fascinating that on page 218 he points out that when these churches are being closed in the Vatican II sect, and these people, I mean, if you interviewed them, the amount of apostasy, it would be staggering. But he points out that, quote, "Sometimes lay people responded with organized resistance to the closing of their parishes. Parishioners at St. Albert the Great Parish in Weymouth, a working-class town south of Boston, took drastic action by occupying their church, changing the locks, and staging a round-the-clock vigil while they appealed its closing. 'My parish, my faith, my family,' said a hand-lettered banner strung over the door. Soon the other people in 7 other parishes in the metropolitan area had organized sit-ins in their churches." End quote. And so they were so upset that where they were married, that building was being closed down. It's an example of how people are deceived and how they value externals and not Jesus Christ and the substance of the faith. He also gives the rundown of the sex abuse settlements the Vatican II Church paid out. It's just amazing to reread the amount of money wasted, poured down the toilet. On page 274, he says, quote, "The settlements paid to victims around the country mounted to the hundreds of millions of dollars. $12 million for the Diocese of Bridgeport, Connecticut, $25 million in Louisville, Kentucky, $5 million in Orange County, California, and on and on. The church in Los Angeles set the record, paying 500 victims $660 million, on top of the $114 million it had previously paid. In Tucson, Arizona, $75 million. Portland, Oregon, $75 million. In Spokane, Washington, $48 million. The judgments led dioceses to seek the protection of the bankruptcy court, and other dioceses considered doing the same. At one point, the scandal seemed unlikely to ever stop spreading." End quote. Another interesting quote is on page 299 concerning John Paul II and how people were so attracted to his, quote, charism. He says, "John Paul II's vivid personality appealed to many prospective seminarians. Some pointed to the experience of seeing him at a World Youth Day rally as the key to their decision to become a priest, and a few had had closer contact. A college quarterback from Buffalo, traveling in Rome with his pastor during an unusual spring break, decided to give up his girlfriend and enter the seminary. After attending a small private mass with the Pope, you could feel his holiness," the football star said. "When he made eye contact with me, I literally had to keep my legs straight and keep myself from falling over. More important was what the Pope stood for, and indeed that he stood so clearly for something. He didn't compromise ever," a young priest from Milwaukee said. End quote. I just found that to be a staggering quote. He didn't compromise ever. It's exactly the opposite of the reality. The guy couldn't have almost committed more acts of apostasy and blasphemy, yet they say that he was utterly uncompromising. This spiritual charism that he had, and this is common, a lot of people talk about this, and the reason he had this charism was because he was completely possessed. And we believe that John Paul II was much more significant than simply an evil man in the Vatican. We believe he was Antichrist in the Vatican, and that's why people were attracted to him. It's also fascinating that many of these apologists in the Vatican II Church who appeal to the conservative audience decided to come into the, quote, Catholic Church, meaning the Vatican II Church, as a result of John Paul II. And they have served really to give life to the beast. They've served to give life to this counter-church. Because if there weren't some signs of spiritual vitality or productive activity among speakers and leaders in the counter-church, those who were somewhat conservative would start to abandon their local churches and look for independent traditional sources. And so the devil had to move in certain people to sort of keep them occupied, so to speak. And I'll just mention one example. We could probably mention many. But this guy, Jeff Cavins, he was a popular figure on EWTN. And he said that he converted to the Vatican II Church after seeing John Paul II at World Youth Day and seeing how many people were attracted to him. It's almost as if he was called by John Paul II. And he obviously did not convert because he was attracted to the historical Catholic faith, although later on he would obviously claim that. But it was almost like he was called by the devil. That's what we believe. And people like him, and he's not the only one, I'm not trying to single him out, but they were necessary for the devil because they keep people occupied. They make people believe that there's some hope in the, quote, official church, when in reality they're just apostates. And so what this person experienced in being attracted and even almost knocked over by John Paul II's presence is very interesting. Those were some of the points that were interesting to consider about this topic.